Welcome to Medicaid Mastery, a cut above explaining the real long-term care Medicaid system.
This is Medicaid Mastery with Medicaid expert Antony Turbeville of Platinum Benefit Services. I'm host Evan Mack. If you or a loved one spends part of the year in Florida and part elsewhere, this episode is for you. We're tackling Medicaid for Snowbirds, what counts as your official residence, how benefits work across state lines, and what you need to know if care becomes necessary while you're away from home. This is Snowbirds and Medicaid, what happens if you split time between states. Welcome back, Tony.
Thank you for having me.
All right, let's get down to it. So if someone lives in Florida, let's say part-time, can they still qualify for Florida Medicaid?
Absolutely. So Medicaid is a part federally funded system and a part state funded and state managed system for Florida. And I believe this is true in all states, but don't hold me to it. And also let me put my disclaimer out there that I am not an attorney. I can't provide legal advice. I'm telling you what my understanding of things is. Ultimately, you would need to verify with an attorney. And if you need an attorney, we're doing that type of work. We'll be happy to refer you to competent attorneys that can answer these questions. When your foot crosses the line and you enter into a nursing home or you need long-term care, and I mean the state line, you are considered a resident of the state for Medicaid purposes. So just because your primary home is in New York State and you happen to be in Florida, you need long-term care while you're in Florida. You're a Florida resident when you are physically here.
So what does Medicaid consider, when deciding your state of residence? What are the things they take into consideration?
For Medicaid purposes, they just care about where you're physically at. So you can't, for example, be in New York, know you're coming to Florida and you're going to need Medicaid and say, oh, well, I'll go ahead and apply for Medicaid in Florida because I know I'm coming there. You cannot apply until you are physically in the state, right? So the only thing they look at is, do you meet the qualification for long-term care health-wise? Do you meet the citizenship requirements? Do you meet the financial requirements? And where are you physically located as you're applying for benefits? You must be in the state. If you're in the state, then you are a resident for purposes of Medicaid.
So what about the benefits? Can you switch Medicaid benefits if you move between states throughout the year?
You cannot. So each time you leave one state, you have to leave the state, disenroll from Medicaid in that state, go to the other state and reapply for Medicaid. You spend 6 months there, you leave, you got to disenroll, go to the new state, reapply. So it's not a very practical thing to do. And to be fair, most people who really need long-term care aren't going to be moving between states anyway. But I have had that question. I've had people try to do that and say, well, that doesn't make sense for me. I got to disenroll from one program and I don't know for sure I'm going to qualify for the other one. And that is a problem in the system. But, I am of the opinion that when you're on long-term care, you shouldn't be going from one state to the other anyway. Now, where this may change is you have a child who lives in another state and they want you to be closer to them after you get on long-term care. Unfortunately, you have to disenroll, go to the new state, and apply there.
So you don't see this too often? Because I know you say typically it's people won't be doing this, but is this a common thing as far as people?
I get the question a few times a year where somebody's thinking about moving their parent closer to them. Most of the time, they just don't do it because the disadvantages are so big. Now, occasionally they do, and another reason I don't see too much of it is many of the people who hire me, probably the majority, truly wouldn't typically qualify for Medicaid without help like ours. So they have some assets that got protected, and most states are not as friendly as Florida. So if they move from here to another state, they may not be able to protect the same amount of assets that they were able to protect in Florida. So from a financial perspective, it most of the time doesn't make sense to move to another state. Now, if they were truly broke to begin with, they didn't have any assets to protect, it's an easier decision to make that transition.
So how do address records, driver's licenses, or even voting registrations affect your eligibility?
So it doesn't directly affect the eligibility, but technically you're supposed to have a valid picture ID for the Medicaid application. There are ways around it if somebody just doesn't have it, but the norm is to submit a valid photo ID, government issued ID. But beyond that, it does not affect qualification.
What happens if a snowbird starts needing long-term care while they're in Florida?
Again, in Florida, they're a resident when they're here. So, if it's home health care, assisted living, or nursing home, typically the nursing home, they're definitely not going to be moving, right? Assisted living, they typically won't be moving. You might see the scenario where somebody gets here, they need home health care, then they want to go back north. But again, they're not going to be going back and forth if they're receiving home health care. They may just want to get back home closer to family. And then they just need to decide, are they going to apply for Medicaid twice, or are they just going to go ahead and leave and go to that state and apply for Medicaid there?
So are there any unique planning strategies for snowbirds anticipating future Medicaid needs?
Essentially, two things you can do. You can plan 5 years ahead of time, called pre-planning. And that's essentially where you take all of your assets and you give them away now to either family members or to a special type of irrevocable trust that has the right wording. It's got to be drafted correctly, but you go ahead and give everything away now. And then once you make it 5 years, you're broke. You can apply in any state you want. The problem is most families don't want to give away their money, especially 5 years in advance. They just can't envision it getting that bad. And so they don't want to do that. They don't want to lose control of the money. But if they do, then that's great planning and that'll work. The other way to do it is to just decide what state's most advantageous for you to be in and stay in that state. So if they're coming, New York actually is fairly liberal. There are other states that are super tough. If you're from Alabama and you're coming to Florida, you probably want to stay in Florida because Alabama is super tough to protect assets in. You can protect some, but nothing like you can Florida. So I would say there's no practical way to do crisis planning moving from one state to another back and forth with the migration of the bird, so to speak.
So you touched on it earlier, but let's change it up a little bit. What about, have you ever worked with any families, or what's the furthest you've worked for, the splitting between two states? You know what I mean? What was the furthest state that you helped the family, do this concept that we're talking about?
I've done Washington State, where they came from Washington
Oh,
to
wow.
Florida, had a stroke while they were here,
Wow.
at their winter home here in Florida, and then they just stayed here and then go back to Washington. Washington's another super tough state. So let me say this to people who are listening and they are from other states. It's not hopeless in other states by any means. You can always protect, half the assets or better. But I like to protect 100% of the assets except for mine and the attorney's fee. And that's what I'm used to being able to do in Florida. There's almost no scenario, well, I've never seen a scenario that I couldn't protect all of the assets. So when you go to a state like Alabama or Washington or some of the more difficult states, and you have to tell the client, well, look, I can save 55, 60% of the money, that feels like a failure when you're used to being able to save 100. But it's not hopeless in other states.
So you talked about Bama, you talked about Washington State. Are there any, what about easier? There's any state as easy as Florida to that kind of work with people in Medicaid?
California can be pretty easy. That's probably not surprising to anybody. They used to be super easy, that if I explained the strategy, you just shake your head and say only in California. But now they've kind of gotten rid of everything. You can just kind of give it away today and qualify tomorrow. I'm not a California Medicaid application expert, but California is pretty easy.
Right. So what should snowbirds do now to prepare in case of a long-term care becomes necessary?
One thing, they should just educate themselves that there are options. Sort of the worst case scenario in Florida is somebody goes to a nursing home, particularly because they're about $14,000 a month as we speak. So it
Wow.
gets expensive quick. You just want to know that there are options, and you want to go ahead and find somebody that you believe can do the job of protecting those assets, so that you can tell the spouse or the kids, hey, if this arises, if I need home health care, assisted living, or nursing home, here's the person to call. Now, of course, we would love for that to be platinum, right? We'll connect you with the right attorneys and all that kind of stuff. But but let the family know. Don't just start writing checks to pay for all the care without considering what options exist for Medicaid and Veterans Administration benefits. While that's not really what we talk about, that is a valuable benefit for veterans or veterans and their spouse or the surviving spouse of a veteran. There's some substantial benefits available, and they're all tax free.
All right, Tony, thank you so much for the information, sir.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. Good to see you.
And thank you all. You've been listening to Medicaid Mastery with Tony Turbeville. For help navigating Medicaid as a snowbird or just figuring out your options when you split time between states, visit platben.com. That's PLATBEN.com, and get connected with an expert who understands your unique situation. Be sure to follow the show, share it with a friend, and leave a review if you found this information helpful. Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.